Hello, I'm Ed Kroll. I'll be interviewing Jim Smith today for the Veterans History Project of the Library of Congress. This is a program that will be shown on the weekly broadcast of the Plainfield Television Group. In addition, a copy of this interview will go into the archives of the Library of Congress for the veterans. Today is Saturday, January 26, 2008. My name is Ed Kroll. Mr. Smith is the subject of this interview. Mr. Smith, please state your name.
My name is James Smith.
And your birth date?
February 25th, 1929.
Okay, we'll begin this interview. What branch of service were you in?
The United States Navy Reserve.
When were you born again?
February 25th of 1929.
Okay. How many brothers and sisters do you have?
None.
None.
I'm an only child.
Only child. Maybe that's good, maybe it isn't. What did your parents do to make a living?
My father was a salesman, and my mother passed away when I was 2 or 3 years old.
Okay.
So I think she was just a housewife.
Okay, before entering the military service, what were you doing?
I had finished high school and I was working. And I joined the Naval Reserve, which is similar to the National Guard. We met once a week, and we had a 2-week training period in the summer. I enlisted in 1947. When I was 18, I enlisted for what they call a minority enlistment. You enlist until you're 21, and then they discharge you. In the Navy, we call it a kiddie cruise.
Okay.
When I was 21 in 1950, I re-enlisted in February of 1950. And the war started in June. I had just gotten married in May. The war started in June. My father passed away the week that I came home from my honeymoon. And in August, I got my orders to report for active duty. And by November, I was gone. And in the next 2 years, I got home once for 20 days.
Okay, so you went through a boot camp first and then?
We went directly to outgoing units because I was a reservist. So I was at Great Lakes about 10 days. And then 3 days later, I was on a ship. So they figured we were ready.
You were ready. So then they were training you as you were actually doing work.
Yeah.
Okay. Was any other family members in your family in the military?
My father was in the infantry in World War I, in the 1st Division. He saw a lot of action, and was wounded and captured and escaped from the Germans, and he had quite a career.
I would think so.
In fact, he went in before we entered the war, and he was in the cavalry on the Mexican border, chasing Pancho Villa with General Pershing and his troops down there. And they were the first ones. He was on the first ship that went to France when we entered the war. So he was an interesting character.
I would think so. I would think so. All right, moving on. Did you enlist or were you drafted?
No, I was enlisted.
Okay. All right, and you served how many years altogether?
6.5.
6.5 years.
Right.
Active reserve after you were out, or?
Yes, I went back to active reserve. I was an instructor. We had a facility at the time at Navy Pier where the filtration plant is now. It used to be a blimp hangar from World War II, and they turned it into a reserve base. And I was a storekeeper in the Navy. I went there for 2 years, 3 years before I went on active duty, and I was learning to be an electronic technician. When I got on the ship, they just made me a deckhand, and one day they asked, anybody type? And I said, oh, I can type. I faked it. Became a storekeeper by accident.
Yeah.
But in those 3 years, I went on a APA. It's an attack passenger assault ship for my 2-week training. We went to Norfolk, and then we went to Bermuda. We had a long weekend in Bermuda and came back, and then we had maneuvers at Little Creek, Virginia. That's kind of a ship that takes on, say, 1,000 Marines. You throw a cargo net over, and they climb down into these landing craft where the ramp falls down, and they go on the beach. Well, we would take on Marines and practice landing them, and I was what they call a bow hook on the landing craft. You stand on a gunnel with about an 8-10 foot pole with a hook on the end. You hold the net, and you keep the landing craft against the ship so the Marines can get down into the landing craft. And you know, you're going up and down, so if they don't time it right, they can break a leg. It's a long fall. Mm-hmm. My second cruise, I was on the battleship Missouri. We went to Panama for 2 weeks. And I was still just a seaman apprentice, so I was still polishing brass and learn how to holy stone decks and that kind of thing. So that's the reason they put us on active duty immediately. We'd already been to sea. We'd already had 2 or 3 years of training. We knew pretty well what to do.
Okay. So then basically you received some specialized training when you were there.
Oh, yes. Much more when
typing.
Yeah, much more than we did on our weekly training. A lot of that was learning how to march and how to handle a rifle and that kind of thing.
Right, all the basics.
But on the ship, you got into everything. They would assign you what they call a running mate. Every reservist that went on a cruise, there would be a regular Navy guy, and you would follow him around, and he would show you what to do. So you learned from the ground up.
Right. So you learn how to swab decks pretty quick.
Oh, yeah. And a lot of other things. Because they did everything. They had general quarters, man overboard. You learn how to plot courses and a lot of training.
A lot of training.
Mm-hmm.
Did you adapt to military life real quick, or did it take you a little while?
No, I had no problems.
Okay.
No, even on my reserve cruises. You know, when I enlisted, the big slogan then was join the Navy and see the world. And up to the time I was 18, I'd never left Chicago. So I figured this is a good chance, and it was true. I saw most of the world while I was in.
Good. Well, when they called you in, how did you get there?
I reported to, there was an office on Randolph Street. I took the L in a subway and hiked it over to the office. We had a brief physical exam, which was kind of a joke. A guy couldn't see the wall chart, and he said, well, you wear glasses? He said, oh, yeah. Well, 20/20 corrected.
Okay.
They had another fellow there, he had a double hernia, and the doctor said, that's all right, we'll fix that in the Navy, you're in. So I don't think they rejected anyone. There was about 40 or 50 of us, all reservists that had been called back in. They wanted people.
Right.
So from there, they put us on a train to Great Lakes, the North Shore train. Took us right up there and put us right in the barracks. They ran us through an extensive physical and gave us our shots and issued all of our uniforms. I remember the first weekend, they said they gave us tetanus and yellow fever and all those shots. They said anybody that donates blood gets to go home for the weekend. So I donated blood, and I was married at the time. I went home for the weekend. I spent the whole weekend in bed sicker than a dog between the tetanus and the yellow fever and giving blood. By Monday, I felt great. Of course, I had to be back.
Back on the ship, yeah. Jeez. How was the food?
Food in the Navy is pretty good. I wasn't fussy. You know, I grew up in a Depression. My grandmother raised me. My father was always looking for work somewhere. We ate what we could. I thought the Navy food was great. There were some meals that were terrible. Being a storekeeper, which I eventually got to be, we broke out the stores, and our people were doing the cooking. They were all in our division, so I ate first. So I usually get the choice of whatever it was. Didn't have to stand in chow lines, and which was good. But we had occasions, especially in Korea, that we ran out of food. We would be out so long that, first place, milk would last 10 to 12 days, fresh things. We'd have powdered soup, powdered milk, powdered eggs. You even run out of that. I mean, there was times we had kidney beans for breakfast and rice twice a day because they couldn't let us go. There was too much action. Mm. And then the way it worked, you would usually go for 30 days, whatever duty, escorting carriers or shore bombardment. And after 30 days, you go back to Japan for about a week, and you'd get more ammunition, more stores, whatever. You'd replace men. Men got sick. Men's enlistments were up. You'd get new recruits, that kind of thing. And then you'd go back out. But if there was a terrific amount of action and they needed us to support troops, we would be out 45, 50 days. And that's when you started running out of things, especially even ammunition. They had ammunition ships come out. We would rendezvous, and we would hand ammunition across underway at sea because we were so low. And the ships would bang together, and that was kind of risky. You drop a 5-inch shell, you grab it and throw it overboard because they could be live. But that's the kind of thing we had in the Navy.
Mm-hmm. So when you're actually on the ship, why don't you fill us in a little bit on what you actually did in your specific job?
Well,
being out on the water, out for 30 days or so, what do they have you actually doing aboard ship?
Okay, on a ship, you have your regular duties. Like I was a storekeeper. I did a job called Jack of the Dust, and he broke out all the dry stores. All across the bottom of the ship, there's storerooms, and that's where you put all cases of canned goods, coffee, whatever that you have to eat that can be dry stores. They have what they call reefers, or refrigerators, for meats and frozen foods. And that's a different storekeeper did that. So I was Jack of the Dust, and when we go back to Japan, we'd have an all-hands loading party. Everybody in the ship would load the stores and get it into the correct storeroom. We had to work up the menus. I worked in the supply office. I worked with a supply officer. We would work a menu up for a week, and we'd have to price it. We were only allocated, I think at the time was like $1.25 a day per man. And everything was priced out. So you knew how many pounds of potatoes you need, how many cans of tomatoes. All of it had to be figured out, priced and extended and totaled and divided by the crew. The idea was to come out to about $1.25 a day.
Which was pretty hard to do.
Wasn't very much, but we're talking about the wholesale price that the Navy paid, which was pretty low. I had to do that for 3 meals a day, plus keep all these records, and I helped the disbursing clerk, which is the guy that paid the troops. We had to keep track of that. Leave, paid leave, a lot of things that had to do with payroll. I did that. But then when you're over, say, Korea, they call condition 3. You're on watch 4 hours and you're off 8 hours. My particular watch was started out as a starboard lookout on the bridge, and then eventually I got to be the captain's talker. That's where I learned a lot about what was going on the ship and in the war, because you stand right behind the helmsman, and the officer of the deck has a chair to the right, the captain's chair. He sits in there and he cons the ship. And it's CONN is a con. He's in control. And that's what they called us, con talkers. I talked to the Combat Information Center. I talked to all the lookouts, and I talked to the fire control people. You could control all the gun mounts electronically from one position above the bridge. And being in that position, I talked to everybody and knew everything that was going on. In fact, I could hear, when we talked to planes coming back from mission, we could hear them on our radios on the bridge. And the captain would, ask them to look for targets. And the airmen were nuts. They'd go down without any ammunition, and they'd say, I can see 3 tanks in the trees, and they would dive down and pull out. He said, right where I pulled out, that's where the tanks are. So we'd fire a few 5-inch rounds in there, and he said, you're about 50 yards too far south. We had people, spotters, those old Piper Cubs, and they would do that for us. And they'd go down low and they'd say, well, I got to get out of here because I'm taking rounds through the wings. And these are just fiber wings on these planes. These guys I thought they were fearless. But they would spot targets for us, and that's a lot of our shore bombardment was either that or things that we saw. There's a front line, and then there's an imaginary line. It's called the bomb line. It's 5 miles north of the front line. So anything north of the bomb line that moved, you shot at it. We tried to keep all trucks off the roads, all the railroads off the tracks. We would knock down a bridge over a stream so the trains couldn't run. They would have that built during the night. It would be back up running the next day. But we had a lot of coastline to cover, hundreds and hundreds of miles. I mean, we weren't the only ship, but that was the main purpose of the Navy in Korea, was to blockade the whole North Korea. Nothing went in or out of North Korea. And we did it successfully. They said it was the longest blockade since the Civil War, and it's the longest blockade in the history of the Navy. It was over 3 years.
All this is being done from the water, about how far from shore?
Oh, we would go within 2,000 yards, even less. There was one occasion where the North Koreans were great for this. They would, at night, they'd come out in small boats and they'd dump off a mine and hope that the tide would float it out and hit one of our ships. Now that was against the Geneva Convention, floating mines, because they could float out into regular passenger routes. And we spotted some of these mines, and we would explode them with small arms or 40 millimeter machine guns. Just a second, horse.
I'll be with you.
Talk too much. We blew up one. It was a gigantic mine, and the smoke, it looked like an atom bomb explosion. It just went up thousands of feet. And some planes coming back from a mission, going to the carrier, radioed our call sign was landlord, 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 you okay? And the officer of the deck said, yeah, we're fine, that was a mine. And these 4 F-9F jets came down over the mountains and down onto the water, and they come right at us, wiggling their wings. They pulled out so close to the ship that the spray from their jets went up and got water on the ship.
Wow.
I was on the bridge. They scared the hell out of me.
I would think so.
But that's the way these guys flew. And they were coming back from, strafing or bombing, whatever. I was on what they call a radar picket ship. They take the torpedo tubes off the second deck and they put extra electronic gear. And we would send out a signal that the planes could home on, and then from us, they could home on the carrier. and it would be like a break point so that enemy aircraft couldn't home direct to the carriers. And we always, as a picket ship, we operated alone almost all the time. So that's what our job, and we did a lot of communicating with aircraft. Luckily, because of our firepower and our Air Force, none of the ships in the Navy in the whole war were ever attacked by air. It was too dangerous. They know if they did, they were gone. So that's one lucky thing. We did get fired at quite often. They would bring out artillery pieces during the night, and as we steamed north looking for targets, they'd lay a barrage on us. Men were killed, ships were damaged, ships ran into mines. We had a destroyer blew the whole bow off. About 18 men were killed. They had to go in reverse all the way back to Japan to get repaired. There was an occasion where we were shelling a town, and we got in close, and there was an island. We had gone up and down this particular area before, and people would go into this town during the night and set up gun mounts, so we would shell it. They called it interdictory fire. Whether we saw anything or not, we'd drop 4 or 5 rounds in. Well, apparently they had come out during the night and they had dug a slit trench on this island. So we were steaming like 10 or 12 knots. We were at general quarters, and they opened up on us. They put an anti-tank shell right through our stack, and they hit the ship with machine gun fire, but their problem was they're aiming too high, because I was a first loader on a 40-millimeter gun. You stand up way high on a platform. Well, you could hear the bullets, buzzing. Zzz, they make a funny noise when they go. When you hear them, you know you're okay. Zzz, over your head. So we kind of opened up on them with everything we had on that starboard side of the ship, 5-inch and 40-millimeter, and just obliterated their position. The thing is that the rear 5-inch on the stern turned all the way around, and it blew off maybe 5 feet from my head. Blew my helmet off, damaged my ear, and I got powder burns in my face and eyes. I ended up in the Yokosuka hospital. And the first loader, he had the same thing. He got knocked down from the concussion. When they fire these guns, the 5-inch, that's a heck of a shell. Then they blow the tube. They get all the hot gunpowder that's left in it out. And that's because it was trained around so far. That's what got a little burns all over. It was just one of those weird accident things.
It's amazing how that works.
Yeah, but that was the most action we had seen, other than the mine and shooting at us with artillery. Okay. That was our problem. What we would do after we did a shore bombardment for 30, 40 days and replenish, sometimes they would put us on escort duty with the aircraft carrier out in a task force. And there would be, say, 2 aircraft carriers, a cruiser, a battleship, and maybe 16 destroyers in a circle. A destroyer is supposed to make sure that that carrier doesn't get torpedoed. I mean, if you keep watching for subs, and if there is a torpedo, you're supposed to run between it and the carrier, and you take the hit, because a destroyer is written off when it's launched. I mean, you're disposable, yeah. Dispensable. Carriers are not. But escorting carriers, it sometimes was boring, but at this particular time, I was over there 9 months. It was from early 1951, when the Chinese they had entered the war in December, chased the Marines down from the Chosin Reservoir. And we got there in like early March. It was like 30 below zero when we were up north. And when we escorted carriers, we would see some of these planes come back. They on fire, they were damaged, and they would ditch in the ocean close to a destroyer who'd have a boat in the water already, they know the guy would radio in, and you could see him coming in, and the flames coming out the bottom.
Okay.
There was one occasion I saw a jet fighter come in, perfect landing in the water, and the guy popped his canopy and got out on the wing. The boat pulled up, and the guy got right in the boat, never got his feet wet. And that plane went down, it's gone. And we always said that Hollywood wouldn't even do that, you know, nobody would believe it. But one of our, because we were a picket ship, they have a destroyer that's assigned as plane guard, and you go astern, a few hundred yards astern of the carrier. In case a plane crashes and falls off, you're real close on either side that you can pick the pilot up. We never had that. We had one plane, I wasn't there at the time, but he hit hard, bounced up, and he came down into parked planes near the bow and exploded. And we lost about 30 planes, and 15, 20 men were killed. But he was shot up bad, and that's one reason nowadays the carriers have the decks cantilevered. When you land, if that happens, you end up in the water. You don't crash on the deck.
On the deck itself. Now, is most of this all during the day or at nighttime?
Both.
Both.
We had one occasion there was a bridge that we couldn't hit, and we had the silent general quarters at midnight, and the idea was we were going to steam in without making any wake, real slow, into the mouth of this river where we could see the bridge. And then at a signal from the captain, they turned on searchlights, and all our 5-inch mounts fired to try and drop this bridge into the river, because it was one of the main bridges on a railroad line. And then we had to back out. That was kind of hairy. But I remember they told us, don't have your keys on your belt and anything that rattle, because when you're coming at night, you know, sound carries for miles. There was no talking, so it was creepy.
That would be creepy, yes.
You know, you're darkened ship and you're like whispering, and all of a sudden, wham, everything goes off.
No flares or anything were popped up to see anything, so you did everything in the dark.
Yeah. So there was a lot of night operations. That was one of the things that was wrong, I should say, with being over there, is that if you're on watch 4 hours, and in 8 hours you got to do all your duties, and then you have general quarters in both times, you don't get 8 hours sleep, very seldom. In the 9 months I was over there, I lost 30 pounds. And when I came back, I gained it all back in a couple of months. But it was very strenuous, you might say.
So say your living quarters, were they adequate? And how many people were on your ship?
Well, we had about 320 men on that ship, and it's pretty crowded, full complement. We slept 4 to 5 high, usually 4, in canvas racks with a mattress, and they had aluminum poles, and your lockers were at the bottom. Like I had the bottom bunk, I had to lift the bunk and chain it up so that everybody could get in their locker as soon as I got out. Mm-hmm. If anybody wanted to get in their locker while I was in the bunk, tough. They had to wait until I got up.
So to get to some of your stations, they set off certain alarms that only you guys know what to do?
Well, they had alarms like man overboard, which is like the ship's whistle goes whoop, whoop, whoop. And of course, general quarters is the bells, and they would give you the whistle, you know, and then say, now hear this, all hands man your battle stations.
Okay.
But then the bells would clang, 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 clang. That's most of the signals that you had. I mean, they passed the word, the bosun would do the pipe, and they'd pass the word like all hands will wear undress blues today, we're going into port or whatever. But there was no other alarms that had different meanings.
Right, so everybody look forward to liberty, huh?
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Yeah, we had a saying in the Navy, you shampoo, shower, and shave, and go ashore and get stewed, screwed, and tattooed.
Did you get any tattoos?
Oh yeah, I have a
You got
couple.
Okay, let's see where else we're going to go here. When you're aboard the ship, how do you stay in touch with your family?
By mail. Many times we wouldn't get mail for weeks, and then we'd get a ton of it all at once. Occasionally they would fly it out to an aircraft carrier, and the aircraft carrier would send a helicopter over, and he'd hover over the stern and lower it on a rope, and we'd get mail that way a couple of times. But usually it was when you had to take men or stores. They brought men out on the aircraft carrier, and we'd throw a high line up. We'd bring new men aboard on the high line. That happened a couple of times. And when they did that, we would trade movies, because we had movies, and we would get our mail.
And as far as writing mail home, when was the best time for you to do that?
Oh.
Especially if you're on working all those hours and then you don't.
A lot of times what you would do, you'd start a letter, and you know it wasn't going to go anywhere for a couple of weeks, and you just keep adding to it. And usually I would write my wife and I would tell her, you know, that I'd start the next paragraph with a different date. Tell her we had a mission and or whatever. I wouldn't tell her too much, she'd get all worried. But that's the way we did our mail. And then they say, when you're going into port, you know you got to get your letters ready. And they had a regular post office. You throw all your mail in there, and bags of it would leave the ship. It would be gone. And you'd get packages sometimes. You know, I'd get cookies and things from home. And usually you could eat them with a spoon by the time you got them. They were pretty
Everybody
crumbled
shared
up.
and had fun with it, yep.
Yeah.
Were you able to call home or anything?
No. Even when we got back to San Diego after our tour was up, you wanted to call home. Usually you went to the YMCA or the USO. You'd have to register your name and you'd wait. They didn't have enough lines in those days. And it would take 3-4 hours before it was your turn to use a telephone. They didn't have enough long distance lines going out of San Diego. And this is 1951. It was kind of weird.
Yes.
Well, another thing that was weird was being in earthquakes. I was in a couple of earthquakes in San Diego and one in Japan. We were on a ship. You could feel it through the ship. But in San Diego, I was on shore, and that's kind of a weird experience. And everything starts to move, and the lights swing, and the furniture moves away from the wall.
You get your sea legs back, you mean?
Yeah.
So was it hard to adjust as far as being aboard the ship, as far as the waves and all that?
You know, as you mentioned, sea legs, when you do get off a ship, it is hard to walk. You have to adjust. I think that's why you see some sailors have that rolling gait. They're still at sea. But there's a little adjustment, especially after I came back from Korea. You're still a little jumpy. You know, loud noises would get you up out of your chair. Other than that, I didn't have much problem. I was in San Diego. My wife came out. She had a vacation, and she stayed with me for about 10 days. I had to go on board every day, but I got to get off every night just because my wife was there. and she went home pregnant. So I was gone 9 months, almost to the day. And I got back the day she was due. So that's the liberty there, the leave that I got. I got 20 days leave. And I flew home, and she was late and late and late. I figured I'm going to have to go back before she delivers. But she finally had the baby about 6 days before I had to go home. Go back to the ship, I should say, not home.
Now, I know when I was in the service, I made friends with a lot of people. Did you make friends with people, and are you still in contact with some of those people?
Yes, particularly on the Perkins, because we went through a lot together. We have an annual reunion, and a lot of the men that I served with come to the reunions. But what we have done with this ship's reunion is anybody that ever served on a ship comes to the reunions. And we have well over 800 men that we have contacted. And we have men from, there was a Perkins in World War II that operated with the ship that my friend here was on, and it was sunk off Guadalcanal. And some of the survivors, they're in their 80s, they still come to the reunions. In fact, the captain of the ship came to one of our reunions up in Michigan. He was like 91 at the time, and he was on the ship when it was sunk. He became the first head of the CIA, and he retired as an admiral. And I recall that he went to the Army-Navy game, and he wore this Perkins hat that we had given him. And he was the oldest Navy man at the Army-Navy game, and there was columns in the paper which I cut out and put in my scrapbook about him, and he was interviewed on television. But that was one of his proudest achievements, was to be captain of the Perkins after all the things that he had done. So he was a swell guy. Mm-hmm. This is a picture of a destroyer I was on, the USS Perkins, DDR 877. I had been on 5 ships, but once you're on a destroyer, you consider yourself a tin can sailor, and that's what I do. Destroyers are the size ship that see a lot of action. They go everywhere, not like a battleship. They're very restricted on where they can go. They don't want a chance of losing them, for one thing. They're too big and expensive. But I think the destroyer man in the Navy is similar to a Marine, comparing him to an Army guy. The Marines see the action, destroyer man sees the action. So I'm always proud of having been a tin can sailor. In fact, I belong to that organization. Now, this is just a representation of some of the medals that I got. The main one I'm proud of is the bottom is Korean service ribbon with 2 battle stars. That means we saw action where people were shooting at us, not just us at them. Other than that, they're just mostly commemorative medals and the fact that you served in a particular area. This medal, Navy Occupation Medal, when I arrived in Japan in '51, we were still occupying the country, and MacArthur was still the supreme commander. In fact, I had taken a train with a couple of shipmates, and we went to Tokyo just to see it. Our home port was Yokosuka, which is maybe 100 miles south of Tokyo. We took one of those Japanese trains up there and walked around. And right across from the Emperor's Palace is called the Diet building. The Diet is the Japanese Parliament. And that's where MacArthur had his headquarters. So we happened to be walking by just when MacArthur was coming in the morning. He still had an old, like 1939 Plymouth staff car. He took this all over the world with him. And they pull up with that, and he got out, and there was crowds of Japanese. And the Japanese really revered him. They figured he was a great warrior. And they all bowed and applauded. Every morning there would be a crowd there just to see him cross the sidewalk to get into the building. And I was lucky enough to be there that day. So it was very interesting. You know, being a Navy man, I can tell sea stories forever.
Well, I'm sure you could. My dad was in the Navy, so I hear a lot of these stories also, and your stories are very interesting, though.
Well, after my leave home, I went back to the Perkins, and while I was gone, I was promoted to petty officer. One of my shipmates mailed me the letter to let me know, and he put in, they call it the crow, you know, the patch on your arm. He mailed me one so I could put it on my uniform to wear back to the ship. But when I got back to the ship, I had orders to transfer to a ship called the Quincy, USS Quincy, a cruiser. It was in mothballs in Bremerton, Washington. And I was going to be part of the 100-man nucleus crew on the cruiser. And the plan was for me to go to school in San Diego for 6 weeks. They call it a refresher school. You learn everything that you ever had. They give you a week's course. First aid, military courtesy, your own particular rate. And then they would send you up to the ship. And you would get the ship ready for the whole complement to come aboard and put the ship back in commission. I went to about 3 weeks of the school, and they said, that's enough. Get on a plane and go to Bremerton, Washington, which is right off Seattle. It's a huge naval base. It still is. It's one of the biggest we have on the West Coast. San Diego and Bremerton are the big ones. That was an interesting experience. I went aboard, and I was the only man from Supply Division, so they said, you're going to be in this compartment. It's bigger than this bank. So I got to pick out which bunk was mine, and I got a nice dead end with no traffic. And after about 3 months, in fact, my wife came out. I had naval housing because I knew I was going to be there 4 or 5 months. The wife came out and with my son, and she lived there, which was very nice. And then after about 2 months, we got 1,200 men from Great Lakes, a train load, mostly all recruits, reported aboard ship. And then we had to start training them, breaking them in. We eventually went out for like 4 or 5 days and come back in to get these guys used to being at sea. So there's a lot of seasick people, a lot of buckets carried around, that kind of thing.
You learn to get used to it real quick.
But then in, I believe it was June, so I was there from like January to June, the end of May, 1st of June. We were transferred to Norfolk, Virginia. So we went down the coast. We stopped at San Francisco. We stopped at San Diego, and we went through the Panama Canal. We spent 6 weeks in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. That's where most ships do their shakedown. That's where you do target practice, everything that has to do with shipboard, all your drills. They bring officers aboard, and they grade you on how well you do all these things. And then we went to Norfolk. So that's, after that, the ship was going to go to the Mediterranean, and I was a short timer. So they transferred me to another cruiser, the Newport News. It was the first ship in the Navy that was totally air conditioned. And that was a real treat, because I went all through Japan. We were in Okinawa for a month in July, and there's no air conditioning on destroyer. You sleep on deck if you can. It's hot. And those guys that work in the engine room and the fire rooms, I don't know how they do it, because it's well over 120, 130 degrees down there.
You know, that steel around you, that can really get hot.
It was nice in the winter. I used to go down there and drink coffee, because I could give them a 5-pound can of coffee, so I was welcome anytime.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, you had a little bit of pull there.
But I was discharged from the Newport News, and we went to the Naval Air Station, and were discharged from there. They tried to get you re-enlist. They offered me 2 years of shore duty in Benton Harbor, Michigan, if I re-enlist for 4 more years. I said, no, I'm going home.
Time to get out, right?
Yeah.
Jeez. Now, did you go back to Chicago then, after that?
Yes. Came back to Chicago.
How'd you get there this time?
I flew. They give us an allowance, travel allowance, which is, I don't know, I think it was $60, but whatever it was, I had enough money to fly home.
Okay.
And I had an old car, which my father-in-law drove all the time I was gone. So he came with the wife and picked me up. And we got our first apartment and all that kind of thing.
Okay, good. Jim, while you were in the service, you're under tight quarters with a lot of different types of people.
Yes.
They could be black, they could be Mexican, they could be Korean.
Oh, yes.
So you get along with pretty much everybody because everybody's the same. You had mentioned something about you were with an African American, and he became a judge.
Yes.
Can you talk about him a little bit? How did you get along with him, and what was the situation?
He was a very close friend. In fact, I have pictures in my album. On Thanksgiving Day in 1950, we all got together and we went to the Roosevelt Hotel in San Diego for dinner. This was a big deal for us. And his name was Paul Leak. And Paul was the only black guy with us. There was about 6 of us. A couple of men brought their wives. And typical hotel where you sit at a big round table and they come around with cameras and try and sell you pictures. So that happened, and I bought a picture, and Paul was with us. And aboard ship in 50, they pretty much stayed themselves. We had Filipinos that were mess cooks for the officers. They stayed in their own clique, and a lot of the black guys did the same. We had not very many on the ship. But prior to that, I had some experiences. The first time I went on a cruise, on an APA to Bermuda, we went to Norfolk with we call it a draft of men from Chicago. There was about 8 or 9 of us. And we took a train. The train at that time went to Newport News, and you got on a ferry, went across to Norfolk. They didn't have a bridge at that time. Now they have a bridge and a tunnel. There's a giant tunnel there. But we got on the ferry, and the water fountains had Negroes and whites only. The restrooms were all segregated in 1950. I had never run into that. I had gone to a high school that was probably 40% blacks. And we called them blacks in those days, not African Americans, right. And there's nothing derogatory about that. I had some very good friends that were black, and I made friends in the service the same way. Another fellow that was very close to me on the ship was Mexican. He came to all our reunions. He was a gunner's mate. He spent 12 years on that Perkins. He loved the ship so much he didn't want to transfer. Ernie Sanchez. The poor guy developed Alzheimer's, and the last reunion he came to, he would go to the restaurant and he'd get lost. He didn't know how to get back to the room, and I was starting to go on him. But Ernie and those guys, we didn't have that same kind of thing in the Navy that other people have, where you were prejudiced. You couldn't afford to be.
Well,
You're all in there together.
everybody goes in equal.
I can recall in Norfolk getting on a bus. We wanted to go, see the town, and of course we had two black guys with us. The bus driver said, "Rear of the bus." So we all went back. They got to go in the rear. We're going to sit with them. He stopped the bus, and the white guys got to sit up in the front. No, we're all together. We're all from Chicago. You get in the front of the bus, or I'm going to throw you off the bus. No, you're not. Well, he pulled over, hailed down a squad car, and the police came on and threw us all off the bus. And I couldn't believe this kind of thing.
Man, it was happening.
Another occasion in 1951, I was in Norfolk. I was on the cruiser at the time. And I'd never been in Washington on my own, so I just took a Greyhound bus up to Washington for a weekend. I had a weekend liberty, and I wanted to walk the sites. I'd walked everywhere. And I had gone to Ford Theater where Lincoln was assassinated. And across the street was a little restaurant, coffee shop kind of place. Lincoln had died on the second floor of this building. They had carried him across the street and brought him up to this, put him in a bed up there. And it was kind of empty. I don't think there was one other customer in there. I had like a cheese sandwich and a cup of coffee. This Marine come in, a black Marine. He had ribbons all the way up to his shoulder. And this jerk said, "We don't serve blacks in here." And I mean, it just infuriated me. We're across from where Lincoln is assassinated, in downtown Washington almost, and this guy's not going to serve a Marine that obviously had been in the Pacific with all the battle stars and things. So I just got up, I walked out. I didn't pay the bill, I didn't finish my lunch. And the Marine just had turned around and walked out, and I was stunned.
Yeah, I would think so.
In 51, I just couldn't believe it. Truman had already integrated the armed forces, but I guess it was too new. People hadn't adjusted. And those are the kind of things that you never forget.
No.
I can still see that guy in my memory.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It still makes me mad.
So when you got home, how were you received? I mean, as far as neighbors and friends and...
Oh, not like Vietnam. There was no parades. Mm-hmm. But the Illinois legislature passed a Korean veterans bill where everybody got $150 cash allotment. I mean, that was a lot of money in 1952 when I got out. Mm-hmm. But you were assimilated. I mean, you came back. The war was still going on. The truce went forever. Even when they were negotiating, that was when we were in Korea. They started it halfway through my tour there. What they were trying to do, the Army and the Navy, was maximum casualties, and then they would go to the truce table and they would say, "Look, we killed 800 of your men yesterday. Isn't it time to sit down and be serious?" They didn't care if we killed 8,000. Casualties didn't bother them. Mainly were Chinese we were fighting at the time. Mm-hmm. The North Koreans were not good fighters, but the Chinese were. There was an occasion that we were off the coast and we saw a sampan come down and go into this village. We were just north of the bomb line. The village was deserted. So the captain wondered what they were doing. And we had a Korean officer aboard as a translator. And an ensign came up, well, we were at general quarters at the time, and he said, we need volunteers that are on the landing force. I was a member of the landing force, so like a dummy, I volunteered. And we went ashore. We wanted to capture these guys and find out what they were doing there and where the troops were, anything we could find out. So we lowered a boat. There was 5 riflemen, the ensign, the Korean officer, and the coxswain of the boat. And we went ashore. We had M1s and 45s, and these guys went into a hut. We saw them go into the hut. We were that close. So we landed on the beach and spread out and went up, and they came out, and they thought we were going to kill them. They were on their knees, begging and screaming. This Korean was really giving them business. They're mean people, I tell you. But he found out that they had been evacuated by the Chinese troops because this was going to be a battle area shortly. And they wanted to sneak in and get their belongings out of the hut. They lived there. They had taken their family north. So we searched their boat. They had nothing in there, and then nothing on them. So we let them take their stuff and hightail it out of there. And we started back this was early in the spring, and it was still pretty cold. And this ensign didn't want to get his feet wet and get cold. And he just told the coxswain, well, gun it, the screws in the sand. And he tried to tell him, no, you got to get out of the boat and push the boat out into the water. No, I'm not going to do that. He said, that's an order. So we blew the engine, and we were stranded. Here we are in no man's land. So we had to get out of the boat and wade ashore and spread out in case the Chinese sent a patrol down, because they told us that all these mountains to our north, that's all Chinese troops. They had to lower the other boat, come in, throw us a line, and tow us back. And we didn't have our combat boots because the executive officer said, well, I issued them to you, you just wear them out. So we had low shoes like these, ruined our shoes, frostbit our feet, and the captain chewed this guy out pretty good. But that was one of my big experiences over there. At least I got on the beach in Korea, in North Korea.
Yeah. So you weren't in the water all the time.
No.
That's good.
Another thing that might be interesting is there was a detachment of Rangers on a little island off North Korea. Many times the North Koreans tried to knock them off of this island, but they had, behind the lines, they had parachuted men in, South Koreans, and they were radioing information to these Rangers, Army Rangers on this island. We would go every morning about 6 in the morning, and they'd come out in a rubber boat, and it's a big, tall lieutenant. He'd bring one of his enlisted men with him, and the guy'd get a shower and a hot meal. And because I was on the bridge, he'd bring us charts, and he'd give us targets. All of these guys who were operating behind the lines, dressed as civilians, would radio in these targets, and we'd know exactly by the coordinates. Sometimes the targets would things that we wanted to hit at night, and we'd fire by radar at tanks or a troop bivouac. Or at night, we know that there's 2 companies of troops going into this tunnel where the bridge is out, but the tunnel is still there. We'd go at night and throw 5-inch shells right in the mouth of that tunnel. On one occasion, the South Koreans advanced through this tunnel, and they found over 300 bodies in the tunnel that we had blown up the night before. So these guys really had some hot targets for us. But later, I read a book on the history of Korea, and this whole operation was in the book, and it was run by the CIA out of Busan, Korea, which is the southernmost spot. and it was a CIA operation with Army Rangers. No, those guys were like British commandos. They were tough guys.
Yeah, they were tough guys, that's right.
But we had a lot of those little stories and things that happened.
Yeah, we can go on and on and on.
Yeah.
There are a lot of stories. When you got back, did you have a hard time adjusting to civilian life again?
No, I didn't. When I was in the Navy, I was shore patrol quite a bit. I was a petty officer and I was big, so I figured you'd make a good shore patrol.
Okay.
So when I came home, I thought, well, man, I might want to be a policeman. I thought it was interesting work. So I went down and applied to be a Chicago policeman, but they had a waiting list like 6 months. And I got a job with a company that I spent 38 and a half years with. But because of people leaving and doing a good job, I got 3 promotions in 6 months. And when the police force called me to come for a physical, I was happy where I was. So I never went. But I come very close to being a Chicago cop. So I adjusted. I was too busy. I had a son and a wife to support. I had a job to do. I had no trouble getting back to civilian life.
Good. Now, some of your buddies, do you still stay in contact with some of them?
Yes. In fact, we had a couple of guys from Chicago that I still contact. I happened to be in a post office one day, and I was picking up mail for my company, and this guy looked familiar, and I walked over, and I said, "Where do I know you from?" He said, "I don't know." I said, "Were you in the Navy?" And it turned out he's a shipmate. He ended up the vice president of Standard Federal Savings. We had quite a few of our men, just ordinary seamen. We had one fellow that didn't even have a high school diploma from North Carolina. He came out and got married, and his wife convinced him to get his diploma, got him into college. To make a long story short, he became a psychologist, and he was a professor of psychiatry at the University of South Carolina. And this is just one of the coxswains on the whaleboat, and that's how he ended up. We had another fellow became a district attorney in New York. A black fellow I made a landing with from Michigan became a Superior Court judge in the state of Michigan. His name was Leak. Wonderful guy. But a lot of these men, the training that you got in the service really helped you. You learn discipline, you learn how to work, you learn how to be clean and neat, especially in the Navy. They were very strict about that. So we had many people that went into things that you never think they would and became very successful.
That's what they do, sure. Did you join any veterans groups?
Not right away. Like a lot of younger people today, I did eventually join the American Legion, and I'm an active member. In fact, I'm chaplain of the local Plainfield American Legion. Been in that position for about 3 or 4 years. The American Legion is very active in the community here. They do a lot of things for veterans groups, and they go to nursing homes, and they go to schools, and we have programs for students. They go downstate. They call it Boys State and Girls State. They send a group of people down. They learn civics for a week. They usually stay in a college dorm in the summer. And they go through the House and the Senate, and they're instructed on how government works. And that's something that the Legion sponsors. There's a lot of activities like that.
Okay.
But that's the main group that I've been in.
Now, did they also do like service for funerals?
Yes, in fact, as chaplain, I go to all the wakes and have prayers. We do a little ceremony.
It doesn't matter if you're in the Navy, the Army,
No.
or Marines?
No. Any veteran that request it, and we have this at the various funeral homes. If they don't have a group that they belong to, they can just call us and we will perform a ceremony. The Abraham Lincoln Cemetery out here in Joliet has a regular service with a rifle squad, and a lot of our veterans are going there now because it's free. The ceremony is very impressive. It's a beautiful cemetery, and there's just, I think there's over 15,000 since it's open have been buried there, and that's only a couple of years. We're currently losing our World War II veterans about 30,000 a month because they're all getting into their 80s, upper 80s, and they're just fading away. And being a Korean veteran, we're next.
You're next. And then I'll follow shortly behind you. Now, how did your wartime experience affect your life?
The wartime part in the Navy did. It taught me a lot of things. I ended up with my company in distribution, which being a storekeeper, I learned the basics. And I eventually became the Chicago district manager, reporting to our headquarters in Ohio. We had 45,000 square feet office and warehouse. I had about 30 some employees under me. I did all the hiring and firing and so forth. And I think a lot of that was due to the training that I received in the service. Even though it was only a few years, it was well done.
And then we got one final question. What were the life lessons of the military service to you?
My wife always said neatness.
And then being in the Navy, you got that.
Yes. I mean, I learned things, you learn how to fold clothes, and I knew how to pack suitcases, and I knew how to cook. In fact, I taught my wife mostly cooking. She wasn't much of a cook. She was a good cook later, but I retired, and she still worked for a year. So I told her, you've cooked for 40 years, I'm taking over. So from then on, I cooked. I did all the cooking. I enjoy cooking.
That's good.
But I learned that in the service.
That's good. Now, is there something else that you want to add to your military service as far as what you did, as far as something else that might have popped in your mind while we're going through this interview? As one final reflection?
When I came back and I got discharged, I stayed in the active reserve. And I think I mentioned that I was teaching a class on storekeeping. And I had maybe 30 men in the class, and once a week. It was much better than when I went in. We had it better organized. And I was teaching this class, and I was telling them, you go on a tender, they had destroyer tenders, and you had a typewriter that was broken, and you wanted it fixed. Well, you're only in port for a week sometimes. You got to have it right away. Well, this guy says, well, I'll have it for you in a month. Well, what do you can't operate without a typewriter. And if you have to share one with some other office somewhere in the ship, that means you're going to be working nights. And so, well, what do you guys need? Well, I could use 5 pounds of coffee. So I was teaching this, you have to do some horse trading if you want to get something done. Sometimes you don't. They'll cooperate, but it depends who you're working with. Well, I had 3 officers from Washington monitoring my class, and I got in trouble for that. I got called down, read the Riot Act 2, and it's not in the program. You stick to the lesson plan. I said, these guys are about to go on active duty. They need to know these things. They're going to learn the hard way. That means they go back to the ship without what they're supposed to have. And that's not good.
No. And what better way to learn is from a veteran.
Yeah. So that was one of the things that I said, okay, I'm going back into the inactive reserve. I had enough of this chicken stuff.
Okay.
So I finished off my enlistment. I just resigned, and my enlistment was up in February of '54, and I got discharged then.
And never want to go back to visit?
Oh, to visit, I don't mind visiting. In fact, we visited, I just went to a reunion in Providence, Rhode Island in June. That was, our annual reunions are held wherever the host lives, so we've been all over the United States. Next year we're going to be in Oklahoma City. But just south of Providence and Newport is Fall River, Massachusetts, and they have the battleship Massachusetts, a destroyer exact type that I was on, the Joseph Kennedy. That was President Kennedy's brother. There's a submarine, and there's a Russian frigate that the Russians donated. And these are all museum ships. And we went aboard the battleship Massachusetts and had lunch. They had arranged a lunch for us. And we ate in the officer's wardroom and toured the ship. And we toured the destroyer. So I enjoy going on all these ships. We had one in Baton Rouge, and they have a destroyer Kidd, which is a different type destroyer. But that's tied up in the Mississippi River right at Baton Rouge. We toured that ship. And then went over to the gambling ship next door.
The gambling ship.
So I enjoy visiting these things.
That's good. All right, Jim, I appreciate everything you had told us. It was very interesting. And thanks again.
Thank you. It brings back a lot of memories. Oh, one thing I wanted to show. Here's a picture. That's me
Handsome little devil.
in 1951
Okay, and what was the rank?
with hair and everything.
What was the rank?
I was a petty officer, third class storekeeper.
Okay.
This is a hash mark, they call it. It's a
that's
red stripe, 4 years in the service. Another thing that might be interesting is the 50th anniversary of the Korean War, they sent this and a medal to every veteran. They must have gotten the names from the Defense Department. But the front is written in Korean, and it's just this is Korean and this is the translation.
Okay.
Appreciation
That's
of our
nice,
service. That was kind of
Very
interesting.
good.
And while I was after I came home recently, I wrote 2 books. Sea Stories and Yarns from the Men of the USS Perkins. We had a newsletter, and guys would send in little stories. And I have stories that I got from them and made this book. I have stories in here from when the Perkins was in 1937, the old Perkins that was sunk.
Perkins, okay.
And there's a lot of stories. And then I wrote my autobiography. I call it White Hats and Bell Bottoms.
Okay, fits you.
So this is the whole history of my service, including some pictures while I was in the Navy. But that's the end of my story.
It's a very interesting story.
All right. Thanks very much,
Okay,
Ed.
thank you. Yeah. All right, once again, Jim, I thank you.
All right. Thank you very much.
This has been a Veterans History program of the Plainfield Television Group, and I'm Ed Kroll.